Hello, my name is Frank Rose, and I'm here to talk about narratives and about the idea of narrative thinking. Narrative thinking, what it means is essentially viewing the world as a story to be told. It's recognizing, it's acknowledging that stories are our common language. It's what the psychologist Jerome Bruner called the narrative mode of thought. It's acknowledging that stories bind us together and stories tear us apart. Everything we basically do because of stories. I've been working in this area for several years now. In 2011, I published my first book on the subject, The Art of Immersion. I had been a writer, a reporter at Wired magazine for 10 years when uh, when a couple of things happened that made me realize that the way stories are told, the way we tell stories is changing and changing directly in response to digital technology. The first sort of inkling I had of this was when I went to Canada, I went to Montreal to do a story on 3D. And the reason I went to Montreal for this is because James Cameron, the filmmaker who had, at that point, this was in 2006, at that point, he had recently invented a stereoscopic camera system, the first real digital camera system that recorded in stereo, in other words, in 3D. And he was there because another director was making the first feature film to be made using his camera system. So I so he actually didn't have a whole lot to do. He was just sort of hanging around the soundstage, and I and this meant that I got actually a fair amount of time with him, and as a result, I was able to, interview him. I interviewed him about 3D. He went into all kinds of geeky explanations about that. And I also interviewed him about Avatar, which was at that point widely rumored to be his next film, but had not yet been greenlit by Fox. When I asked him about this, however, he was very reluctant to go into any detail. Basically, what he said was that he saw it as this sort of Edgar Rice Burroughs style action adventure film that happened to take place on another planet. Edgar Rice Burroughs, of course, being the author of the Tarzan stories. And he went on to say something that really intrigued me, though. What he said was that for him, the best way to tell such a story was to tell it almost as a fractal experience, so that you could, if you were a casual fan, you could just watch the movie and that would be fine. But if you were a more committed fan, you could go deeper and deeper into the story and the pattern would still hold. And this, I realized eventually, was the key to a whole new way of storytelling that has since become more or less ubiquitous, that we see all around us. We see television shows, motion pictures, stories of all kinds, immersive theater, all of these things presented in this way, so that if we want to, we can go deeper and deeper. And as Cameron said, the pattern would still hold. That was the gist of The Art of Immersion. My next book, which was published about a year or so ago, is called The Sea We Swim In. And it's an outgrowth of the executive education program I teach at Columbia University, which is called Strategic Storytelling. Strategic storytelling is, as the name suggests, about how to tell stories that are strategic, that, in other words, have a long-term purpose, an important purpose that aren't just for the moment, but that as an organization, as a company, as a nonprofit, an NGO, as an independent professional or an entrepreneur, are going to advance your your cause. You're going to advance, basically everything that you're working on, everything that you're trying to communicate. And in the introduction to this program, I use this image. A lot of you may recognize it. It's called the Blue Marble. It was shot in, I believe, 1972 by the Apollo astronauts. It was the first photograph to be taken by an astronaut that showed the entire Earth. And when this was published, on the Earth in the early 70s, it caused quite a stir. And it caused people to realize, as the astronauts themselves had realized, it caused them to realize that we're on this small planet, this little planet in a huge, vast sea of blackness, and that we are very lucky, and at the same time, very, very fragile, our existence. And so it really ushered in a new form of consciousness, or it seemed to, in any case, a sort of a sense of the Earth, a sense of the planet, a new sense of the planet. However, what has happened since is in many ways a retreat to a mode of thought, a way of thinking that dates at least back to the 19th century and often before. What you're looking at now is a 19th century drawing of a flat Earth. The idea that the Earth is flat has been around for a long time. As this image suggests, this is touted as a biblical view of the Earth, which somehow apparently the Bible saw the United States and Canada, pretty much the center of things. But anyway, this idea that the Earth is flat, that that we're not on the sort of spherical blue marble that the Apollo astronauts saw, that in fact the whole everything about the Apollo program and NASA and space exploration and so forth is really just a giant hoax. It's sort of one of the most anti-scientific modes of thought that you can imagine. And yet it has gained a lot of currency in the past couple of decades, largely, I think, through YouTube, because YouTube's algorithm, ironically, has, in many cases, steered people toward videos that espouse this view. And the irony is that YouTube, of course, relies on the latest digital technology, much of the same technology that NASA and the European Space Agency and other similar organizations are using today as well. But what you have with YouTube and other forms of social media are algorithms that are designed to engage people and to keep them engaged and to keep them clicking on the next, the next video. What this shows is really the need for scientists to be able to tell stories, to be able to talk about what they're doing in ways that non-scientists, that lay people can understand and that can engage us, that don't sort of leave us behind. And now I've been, as I said, focused on the study of narrative for quite some time. And one of the surprising things I came to realize is that for decades, scientists of all sorts had disdained narratives. Cognitive scientists and earlier forms of cognitive science and earlier psychologists, they considered it was frivolous. It was merely entertainment. It was not worthy of serious study. But in the 1980s, Jerome Bruner, whom I mentioned earlier, in a book called Actual Minds, Possible Worlds, took issue with this, took issue with this attitude that stories were not worth studying. He said that there are really two modes of thought, that each of them provides a distinct way of seeing the world, of viewing the world, and of also constructing reality. What he means here is that we understand what's going on around us. We understand reality. Our whole concept of reality comes from stories that we tell each other, that we read, that we watch, that we see, and that stories are far from being merely frivolous, merely entertainment, are really central to who we are. So as I mentioned, YouTube's algorithms steered people toward videos espousing the flat Earth theory, espousing all kinds of controversial and, in many cases, blatantly false ideas. Now, this has itself been the object of a considerable amount of study. And what people have found, for example, in this paper from Science Magazine, is that contrary to popular belief, it's not actually bots that spread these, these false videos, these false ideas. It's really humans. It's people who are, sort of intrigued by them, who are, it's people who are intrigued by them. It's people who find them to be more interesting than stuff that's actually true. And there's an element of surprise, of course, and that means that it's actually more attractive to people because people are just sort of inherently attracted to things that are, a little bit different from what they expect. And so this idea that it's bots that spread misinformation, that spread disinformation, is actually not borne out by the research, at least the research today. We'll see what happens with the evolution of ChatGPT and other, forms of artificial intelligence. But at this point, at least, it's basically people who spread disinformation to other people. There's some very interesting lessons, I think, in the work that has been done by cognitive scientists and neuroscientists in the past 20 years or so about stories and storytelling, and in particular, how we process stories, how we understand stories, what the brain has to do in order to make them work. So one of the really key studies to show how we process stories originates with this book that I'm showing you here. One Boy's Day was actually published in 1949. It was a research project of the head of the psychology department at the University of Kansas. And he had the idea that he wanted to study humans in their natural habitat. And to him, what that meant was to go to a small town, of which there are any number in Kansas, to go to a small town and study people, study everything that they did. So he went to this little town called Oskaloosa, which is literally a one stoplight town. And he set up shop in the second floor of this bank building that you see here on the left. And that became what he called his Midwest Psychological Field Station. And what he did there, he and the grad students who were working with him, was to, as I say, follow people around. And in particular, he picked a 7-year-old boy whom he called Raymond, and he and his team spent a great deal of time with Raymond. And what they did in One Boy's Day was to record everything that Raymond did. during that time. So One Boy's Day was really a landmark in the history of psychology. It was an approach to understanding human behavior that was unique, certainly somewhat clinical, but quite intriguing at the same time. Now, the work that I'm going to focus on is not actually One Boy's Day itself. It's a study that was done many, many years later, a neuroimaging study at Washington University in St. Louis. And the gist of the study was to find out how people would process the story of Raymond as he went through his day. So this was a functional MRI study. They ran people into an MRI machine and left them there with a projection above their heads of some text from this book, from One Boy's Day. And what they found was quite interesting. It was that whenever Raymond, the schoolboy, was in the classroom and he, say, picked up his pencil to take notes, the parts of the brain in the readers that have to do with grasping motions lit up. And whenever Raymond stood up and started to approach his teacher's desk, the parts of the brain that have to do with location and space lit up. And this was a very interesting finding because it suggested very strongly what a lot of psychologists were already beginning to suspect, which is that essentially, when we read a story or when we watch a movie, anything like that, when we read an article, we are modeling what is happening in our own brains. We are modeling what the characters are going through. It is essentially a simulation. We are simulating the events of the story, as the researcher who headed the study wrote in her paper. And the simulation becomes a way of understanding the story, a way of identifying with the characters, and is very, very important in how we understand stories, how we project ourselves into stories. There are many things that follow from this, and I'm going to go into a couple of them now. Around the same time as this study at Washington University in St. Louis was done, the study of One Boy's Day, another psychologist, Jeff Kaufman, who at the time was at Ohio State University, did a study that was equally fascinating. It was about how we identify with characters in the stories that we read or watch or whatever. And why do we identify with some characters more than others? And what effect does that have on our response to the story? So Jeff Kaufman conducted a couple of studies that were written up in a paper that had to do with the behavior and the attitudes of the people who were reading the stories. The first study that he did was about a student who was trying to vote. He had his test subjects, who of course were students at Ohio State, read a story about the student who was trying to vote. And all kinds of things were getting in his way. His car broke down, the weather, everything. Everything seemed to be conspiring against him in his attempt to vote. And somehow, though, he manages to actually get to the polls and to cast his vote. Now, the interesting thing about this study was that it was conducted a week before the 2008 presidential primaries, in which Barack Obama ultimately became the Democratic nominee for president. And what Kaufman wanted to find out was not just, how this story affected people's attitudes or whatever. He wanted to find out if it actually motivated them to vote. And what he found was, yes, it did, very much so. There were 4 versions of the story, and each student got one of these 4 versions. In 2 versions, it was about an Ohio State student, a fellow Ohio State student. In one of these, it was told in the first person. In another, it was told in the third person. And then there was another version of the story, which was more or less identical, except it didn't take place at Ohio State. It took place at Denison, a small liberal arts college, which is about 70 or 80 kilometers away from Columbus, the state capital, which is also the place where Ohio State is located. And there's, of course, as you might expect, sort of a rivalry between Ohio State and Denison. Denison being, as I say, the small liberal arts college, Ohio State being a very large urban university. And so when the Ohio State students read about the student at Denison who was trying to vote, their behavior was very different. Far fewer of them actually went ahead and voted. That was one part of Kaufman's study. The next part of his study had to do with a gay student. And there were, again, a couple of different versions of this story. The story that there were a couple of different versions of this story. And the test subjects in this case were straight male Ohio State students, and they were reading a story about a gay student. The test subjects in this case were straight male Ohio State students, and they were reading a story about a gay student. But in this case, what happened was, in one version of the story, the student was identified as gay very early on, like in the first paragraph. He mentioned his boyfriend. In another version of the story, this mention didn't come until considerably later in the story, on the second or third page. And at that point, the feeling was that at that point, the test subjects would have already identified with this character, and that the fact that they learned he was gay would actually not make very much difference. The feeling was that that would change their attitudes toward not just this character, but perhaps toward gays in general. And that, in fact, is what they found. There's one more study that I want to talk about. This one was also done at Ohio State, actually several years earlier, by a grad student named Melanie Green, who is now a professor at the State University of New York at Buffalo. And this was a study, as it turns out, that had a great deal of influence. It was one of the first cognitive science studies that really got at how people are affected by stories. And her goal in this experiment was to find out if our attitudes toward a subject can be changed by whether or not we become more or less immersed in a story about that subject. And in this case, what she did was she took a story about a murder in a shopping mall. And of course, shopping malls and murders don't really go together. We sort of think of them as safe places and, very hedonistic. We love to shop, at least Americans do. And so this idea that something would happen, like something so violent would happen there, was kind of foreign. Now, the story that she had her test subjects read, she called it "Murder at the Mall," and it was actually taken from a book that had been published a few years earlier in the very early 90s called "How We Die" by a physician named Sherwin Newland, and the book was literally about how people die, what happens physiologically when people are when people encounter various accidents, and other things that cause death. So this particular story, which he took almost word for word from the book, uh, involved a little girl and her older sister who had taken her little sister to the shopping mall one afternoon, and a mental patient who was out on leave, who, unbeknownst to anyone else, had a very large knife. Now, when the older sister was looking at store windows and things like that, she sort of lost track of her younger sister. She heard screams. She turned around, and the little girl was being viciously attacked by the mental patient, who was stabbing her again and again and again. In Sherwin Newland's book, this was supposed to be an example, an illustration of exsanguination, what happens when we bleed out. In Melanie Green's experiment, however, it was something different. She wanted to, as I say, find out if the fact that we became more or less immersed in the story would affect our attitude toward, for example, mental patients going out on leave, or the dangers of being in shopping centers, that sort of thing. And so in order to do this, she had to start by sort of quantifying immersion, which nobody had actually done before. We've always had this sense that we could become immersed in a story, the classic example being, you're reading a novel on your train and you forget to get off at your stop, and you look up half an hour later, and there you are. So again, there were different versions of this story that she had her test subjects read. In one version of the story, it was presented as a newspaper article. It was formatted like a newspaper article, and that's what it looked like. And people were told that it was true. In another version of the story, it was formatted to look like it had come from a literary magazine, and her test subjects were told it was fictional. She wanted to find out if the fact that it was being presented as true or fictional, how would that affect people's attitudes toward, for example, mental patients going out on leave? But she also wanted to find out, as I say, how she also wanted to find out, as I say, how people would respond to the story based on whether or not they became immersed in it. And, so she had a series of questions. She presented a series of questions to the people who had just read the story that had to do with things like, I really identified with the characters. I really had a sense of how the story should end. This sort of thing, things that would suggest that the reader was really immersed in the story, and that the reader really identified with the characters. What she found was that the more readers were immersed in the story, the more likely they were to come away with ideas or attitudes that were in line with what the story would suggest. In this case, that mental patients should not be let out unsupervised, or that people are being stabbed in shopping centers considerably more often than they actually are. What she also found, however, was that it really didn't matter whether people were told the story was fictional or non-fictional. That did not affect their beliefs or their attitudes. The only thing that seemed to matter was whether people were immersed in the story, or in the lingo of cognitive psychologists, whether they were transported by the story. Transportation theory is this is sort of this is one of the founding documents, if you will, of transportation theory. This idea that a story can transport us into another world, the world of the story. It's essentially the same as the whole idea of immersion. It's just the way that psychologists present the issue. What all this suggests is that we're not, in fact, the rational creatures that we like to think we are, that we're very emotional. And of course, emotion is sort of the lingua franca of stories. We have data, we have facts. These are not emotional. And this, of course, is what scientists are focused on. But stories are emotional, and humans, including scientists, are very emotional creatures. And we are, in fact, though we like to think of ourselves as rational, for example, economic creatures who act in our own self-interest, this is demonstrably not the case. And Dan Ariely, the author of the sort of breakthrough book, Predictably Irrational, a sort of breakthrough in behavioral economics, has made this point time and again. In my executive education program at Columbia, I've come up with what I consider the 9 key elements of story. They are presented here. The 3 most fundamental, most basic are the author, the audience, and the journey. Below that, you have other things that are really important to the development of a story, but not quite perhaps so fundamental. You have the voice in which it's told, the characters that populate it, the amount of detail or lack of detail that it includes, the world that it inhabits, what used to be called the setting, before we became, quite so aware of the idea of world building. Ultimately, then the platform that it exists on, the idea that we have, that we are telling not just one story in most cases, but a whole constellation of stories, and that this forms a sort of a narrative platform, which in turn leads to our increasing immersion in the story. Now, for the purposes of this, I'm going to focus primarily on these first 3. And I want to look at the critical issue in each of these. And I want to take an example that I think will, perhaps illuminate what is at stake here. The idea is that as the author of a story, you need to know who you are and why you're telling the story. Otherwise, you're not going to be very successful. The key issue here, then, is identity. Who are you? What do you want to say? What is your objective in saying it? Now, as I mentioned, I'm going to give an example here. This is Neil deGrasse Tyson, one of America's most distinguished scientists, Harvard and Columbia educated. He's sort of this rock star astrophysicist. He's director of the Hayden Planetarium in New York City. And he's the winner of the Stephen Hawking Medal for Science Communication, as well as a frequent guest on talk shows. a few years ago, he appeared on a show called The Nightly Show on the Comedy Central network. And his appearance was in response to the rapper B.O.B., who had just come out with this idea that the earth is flat. He was a rapper. He was, a very popular public figure. And this was, having a lot of influence. So that's why Tyson wanted to come on and refute this. And he said a lot of things like this. It was really fun appearance, and the audience loved it. Now, the audience, of course, is going to have to be a main focus of any story that you are telling. The story has to be tailored to the audience. It has to be the audience has to be, somewhat amenable to the story or to the characters. It has to be able to identify with the characters. And as we see here, the main currency in this case is attention. You need to get the attention of the audience. You need to know who you're trying to reach, and you need to know what you want them to take away from the story. Now, in the case of Neil deGrasse Tyson appearing on Comedy Central, it was great for his audience, for the TV audience. Let's say that probably not a lot of flat earthers are real Comedy Central fans, and they're certainly not fans of anyone like an astrophysicist who's associated with NASA and with what they would consider the whole sort of round Earth conspiracy. What Tyson was essentially getting across in a very funny way, very entertaining way, was that flat earthers are really just dumb as a post, really dumb. And that's fine if your goal is to, stoke the round Earth holdouts from flat Earth theory. The folks who are, from the flat earthers' point of view, part of the whole conspiracy. But let's say you wanted to try to convert someone. Let's say you wanted to actually reach a flat earther. In this case, the approach that Tyson took really wouldn't work very well at all. Now, if you remember what I said earlier about people becoming immersed if they identify with a character, and about the more immersed you become, the more likely the story will change your attitude about something. In this case, the character is really the storyteller himself. And the flat earthers are not going to identify with someone like Tyson. And that gets to the nature of stories themselves. Now, the story is what I'm talking about here when I mention the journey. Stories are something that, start in one place and end somewhere else, whether it's literally geographically speaking or speaking in terms of time, or more psychologically speaking, something happens. And almost always there's some element of conflict, because conflict gives us a reason to care. Will our heroes, manage to save the planet? Will the European Space Agency actually be able to use the James Webb Telescope to find galaxies that are billions of light years away? To peer not just into space, but to peer billions of years into the past. Without conflict, you have no story. That's the conventional attitude in any case. It's certainly the classic attitude in terms of stories that are presented as entertainment, whether they're novels or movies or whatever. And in this case, that's great if, like Tyson, what you really want to do is to sort of highlight your conflict with the flat earthers. But what if what you actually want to do is to get through to them? What if you want to try to communicate with them? If you want to, maybe try to change their attitudes, that requires another approach entirely. A couple of years ago, these two guys, Daniel Brookman and Joshua Kalla, they did a series of experiments that involved trying to convince people to take a different attitude toward some subject. In fact, they were, in this case, largely focused on issues like gay rights, on social issues. And they found that the really pretty much the only way to get through to people was not to argue with them, not to make fun of them, certainly, but to have a discussion, almost like a heart-to-heart, that involved a lot of listening and, both parties telling stories to each other about their own experience. If you were, inclined to not, like gay people, not like the fact that, not like the issue of gay marriage or gay rights, they would engage you with stories that were not designed to be argumentative, that were not designed to, spout facts, but were designed to elicit your feelings about the whole issue and your own experiences. And then they would tell you their experiences. And what they found was that this was actually a very effective way of communicating with people, a very effective way of sharing your viewpoint, of sharing your attitude toward life, of sharing your knowledge in a way that was not threatening to people and that gave them the possibility of changing their minds. So, we've seen here what you can do with by telling a story that's so compelling that people tend to immerse themselves in it. We've seen what you can do with stories that feature a character that the audience can identify with, or even if it's not a character that they are likely to identify with, there are certain things that you can do to encourage them to do so. And we see now that there are ways to change people's opinions, to change people's attitudes that have to do with listening as well, and with trading stories. And I feel that this is something that is very important. I feel that it's something we all have to be aware of, and we all have to try to do. It's not easy. As scientists, I'm sure that you have very, very strong feelings about this sort of thing. I do as well. But if we're going to sort of communicate with other people, if we're going to, try to change their attitudes, if we're going to have a widespread view of science as positive and an essential part of our lives that is going to guide us into the future, then this is an approach that I think we seriously need to consider.